Win this, and I'll give you $100 million. The words landed in the center of Veritas Crown, one of the most exclusive restaurants in downtown San Francisco, with the weight of a challenge and the sharpness of a public joke. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow of chandelier light. Silverware paused halfway to mouths. Conversations dissolved into silence. Then came the laughter. Low at first, then louder. The kind of laughter rich people use when they think they're watching someone else become the evening's entertainment. Richard Kessler leaned back in his chair and smiled. At 42, the billionaire CEO of Kessler Dynamics had built a reputation on winning. Winning contracts, winning negotiations, winning rooms. Tonight was no different. At least, that was what he believed. His custom navy suit fit perfectly. His watch reflected more money than most families earned in a decade. Investors, executives, and business reporters surrounded him, hanging on every word as if success itself had taken human form and reserved a table. Across from him stood Cassandra Brooks, a black waitress carrying a tray she suddenly wished weighed more than it did. Her shoulders remained straight. Her expression remained calm. But anyone paying attention would have seen the tension behind her eyes. She had spent years serving people exactly like this. People who spoke about opportunity while refusing to see the people standing directly in front of them. People who measured worth by bank accounts and job titles. People who could spend $10,000 on dinner and still leave without learning a single person's name. Tonight, however, something was different. Tonight, her 10-year-old daughter was sitting only a few feet away. Maya Brooks sat quietly in a corner booth near the service station, a small notebook resting on her lap. She looked completely out of place among venture capitalists, luxury handbags, and million-dollar conversations. Yet somehow she looked more comfortable than anyone else in the room. Her dark eyes moved carefully from face to face, observing everything, listening, learning, the way she always did. Earlier that evening, a group of executives had been discussing a high-profile strategy competition Richard often used during networking events. It was famous in Silicon Valley circles. Part puzzle, part logic challenge, part performance. A game designed to showcase intelligence in front of an audience. Richard loved it because he almost always won. When he noticed Maya sitting quietly with her notebook, curiosity quickly turned into amusement. "Does your daughter know what this is?" he had asked Cassandra. The question sounded innocent. The smile that followed was not. A few guests chuckled. Cassandra offered a polite response and tried to move on. But Richard wasn't finished. He explained the challenge. He described how CEOs, engineers, and Ivy League graduates regularly failed it. Then he glanced toward Maya and laughed. "Tell you what," he said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "If she wins, I'll hand her a check for $100 million myself." More laughter, more smirks, more sideways glances. The room had already decided how the story would end. Maya slowly closed her notebook. She slid from the booth. The sound was almost impossible to hear beneath the laughter, but somehow it felt louder than everything else. Cassandra immediately shook her head. She knew where this was going. She knew what people like Richard expected. Embarrassment, compliance, silence. But Maya gently touched her mother's hand. Then she stepped forward. Small sneakers against polished marble floors. 10 years old, barely tall enough to reach the edge of the table. The laughter continued for another second. Then another, until Maya finally looked directly at Richard Kessler. Her voice was calm, not nervous, not angry, calm. "I'll play," she said. And for the first time that night, Richard's smile froze. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence that settled over Veritas Crown felt heavier than the laughter that had filled it only seconds earlier. Richard Kessler studied the little girl standing across from him and waited for the punchline. In his world, confidence usually came from power, experience, or money. Maya Brooks appeared to have none of those things. Yet she stood there without hesitation, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm enough to unsettle people twice her age. Around the restaurant, guests exchanged amused looks. Some reached for their phones. Others leaned closer to their tables, sensing that the evening had suddenly become more interesting than any business deal being discussed. Cassandra Brooks felt every eye in the room pressing against her. She wanted to protect her daughter from embarrassment. She wanted to tell Maya to return to her booth and let the moment pass. But something in her daughter's face stopped her. Maya was not acting impulsively. She was not seeking attention. She looked exactly the same as she did at home when she sat quietly at the kitchen table solving puzzles while rain tapped against the apartment windows. Richard finally laughed again, although this time the sound carried less certainty. "You are serious?" he asked. Maya nodded. "Yes, sir." A few people smiled at the politeness in her voice. Richard folded his arms. "Do you even understand the challenge?" Maya looked at the board displayed on the digital screen beside the private dining area. "I understand enough to try." Another wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. Richard shook his head. To him, this was becoming entertaining. To everyone else, it was becoming something harder to define, because the little girl was not behaving the way they expected. She was not intimidated. She was not excited. She was simply present. The restaurant manager appeared near the edge of the room, nervous about the attention gathering around one of the most important clients in the city. Investors paused conversations worth millions of dollars. A local journalist lowered her coffee cup and started recording. Somewhere in the background, a piano continued playing soft jazz, but even the music seemed distant now. Maya's notebook remained on the booth where she had left it. The worn cover showed years of use. Nobody paid attention to it. Nobody knew that inside were hundreds of pages filled with observations, sketches, equations, and ideas collected during countless evenings spent waiting for her mother to finish work. While other children played games on tablets, Maya had developed a habit of studying people. Patterns fascinated her. Decisions fascinated her. Problems fascinated her most of all. Richard stepped toward the challenge screen and gestured dramatically. "All right," he said. "Let us see what happens." More guests gathered. The circle around them widened. Cassandra noticed something strange. The smiles were changing. At first, people had looked at Maya with amusement. Now some looked curious. Others looked concerned for Richard, though they did not yet understand why. Maya slowly glanced around the room. Wealth, influence, prestige. Every symbol of success stood within a few yards of her. Yet none of it seemed to matter. Her attention returned to the screen. Richard watched carefully, expecting uncertainty to appear on her face. Instead, Maya tilted her head slightly, studying the challenge with quiet focus. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed loud. Richard opened his mouth, preparing another joke. But before he could speak, Maya smiled softly. It was not the smile of a child about to take a guess. It was the smile of someone who had just noticed something everybody else had missed. Richard Kessler narrowed his eyes. The confidence he had worn all evening remained on his face, but something underneath it had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet people close enough could see it. The billionaire was no longer looking at Maya Brooks as a joke. He was looking at her as a question. The challenge displayed across the large screen beside the dining area had defeated executives, analysts, and engineers at previous events. That was part of its appeal. It was designed to reward people who thought differently. Ironically, the room was full of people who claimed to value innovation, yet many of them had already dismissed the one person they knew the least about. Maya took another step forward. The polished marble floor reflected the chandelier light above her. She studied the puzzle without speaking. 1 minute passed, then another. Nobody interrupted, even the servers moving between. Tables slowed down, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Cassandra remained frozen near the service station. Her heart pounded harder with every second. She trusted her daughter, but she also understood how quickly public attention could turn cruel. Rich people often celebrated success, but they rarely forgave failure. Across the room, a venture capitalist whispered something to the person beside him. A reporter adjusted her phone camera. Someone near the bar quietly placed a bet on how long it would take before the little girl gave up. Richard heard the murmurs and smiled again. The room was returning to familiar territory. Control, expectations, predictability. Then Maya finally spoke. "The answer is not the answer." Several people exchanged confused looks. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Maya pointed toward the screen. "Everyone keeps trying to solve the final problem. That is why they fail." A few guests frowned and looked back at the display. Richard folded his arms. "Go on." Maya's voice remained calm. "The challenge assumes a starting condition that is impossible. The mistake happens before the puzzle even begins." The laughter disappeared completely. Richard glanced toward the screen. For the first time all night, he did not immediately respond. The challenge had been reviewed by experts, mathematicians, consultants, senior executives. Nobody had ever questioned its foundation. They simply accepted the rules and worked within them. Maya continued studying the display. If the first assumption is wrong, every solution afterward is wrong too. The words hung in the air. The kind of silence that follows when people begin realizing they may have overlooked something important. Richard walked closer to the screen. He examined the opening conditions himself. Slowly, carefully, the confidence in his posture began to tighten. Guests noticed. They always noticed changes in powerful people. It was one of the reasons power fascinated them so much. Maya did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply waited. Her patience felt older than her years. Finally, one of Richard's senior executives stood up from a nearby table. He stared at the display for several seconds before quietly muttering, "That cannot be right." Another executive checked the numbers. Then another. Suddenly phones were no longer recording Maya. They were recording the screen. Cassandra watched the entire room change direction like a tide turning against the shore. People who had ignored her daughter 20 minutes earlier were now examining every word she spoke. Richard remained silent longer than anyone had ever seen. Then Maya pointed to a single line buried near the beginning of the challenge. "There," she said softly. "That is where the mistake starts." And when Richard followed her finger, the color slowly drained from his face. The room did not react all at once. It happened in stages. First came the silence. Then came the staring. Then came the uncomfortable realization spreading from table to table like a ripple across still water. Richard Kessler remained focused on the line Maya had identified. The challenge had been part of his executive events for years. Hundreds of accomplished professionals had attempted it. Some had spent hours analyzing it. Others had built presentations around it. Yet none of them had ever questioned the assumption buried near the beginning. An assumption so small it appeared invisible. Until now. One of Richard's analysts stepped forward and adjusted his glasses. He studied the screen again. Then he opened a calculator on his phone. 30 seconds later, he stopped typing. Another executive repeated the process. Her expression changed immediately. The confidence that had filled the private dining area began draining away. Maya stood quietly while adults with advanced degrees rushed to verify what a 10-year-old girl had noticed in minutes. Cassandra could hardly believe what she was seeing. For years, she had watched her daughter fill notebooks with observations most people ignored. Maya had always noticed patterns. She noticed when prices changed at grocery stores. She noticed when traffic lights followed unusual sequences. She noticed mistakes hidden inside board games, newspaper puzzles, and even television quiz shows. Most people called it curiosity. Cassandra had learned long ago that it was something deeper. Richard finally looked away from the screen. His eyes settled on Maya. "How did you find that?" he asked. The question carried none of the amusement from earlier. Maya answered honestly. "I stopped trying to solve the problem." Several guests frowned, trying to understand. Maya continued. "Everybody assumed the challenge was correct because important people created it. So everyone focused on finding the answer. I wanted to know whether the question itself made sense." Another silence followed. This one felt heavier, because everyone understood the implication. Sometimes intelligence was not about knowing more. Sometimes it was about questioning what everyone else accepted without thinking. Near the back of the room, a technology journalist lowered her phone and simply stared. She had interviewed founders worth billions. She had attended conferences around the world. Yet she could not remember the last time she had seen an entire room change its opinion so quickly. Richard glanced toward the executives seated around him. Nobody was smiling anymore. Nobody was laughing. The challenge that had once made him look brilliant was now exposing something else entirely. Maya had not beaten the puzzle. She had exposed its flaw. Those were two very different things. A waiter accidentally paused in the middle of serving a table, too distracted to continue. Conversations throughout the restaurant had completely stopped. Even guests with no understanding of the challenge recognized what was happening. Power was shifting. Not financial power. Not corporate power. Something far more uncomfortable. The power of being right when everyone expected you to be wrong. Richard slowly walked closer to the screen again. He reviewed the numbers one final time. The conclusion remained unavoidable. Maya was correct. The foundation of the entire challenge was flawed, which meant every previous winner had succeeded only because nobody noticed the original mistake. Richard exhaled slowly. For the first time that evening, The billionaire found himself standing in unfamiliar territory. He was no longer controlling the moment. Maya was. Then she glanced toward the booth where her worn notebook rested and quietly said, "There is another problem too." The entire room froze again. The words seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "There is another problem too." Maya's voice was quiet, but every person inside Veritas Crown heard it. Richard Kessler slowly turned toward her. The billionaire who had spent years commanding boardrooms now found himself waiting for a 10-year-old girl to continue. Around him, executives shifted uneasily in their seats. Investors exchanged nervous glances. The challenge was already falling apart before their eyes. Nobody was prepared to hear there might be something even worse hiding beneath the surface. Maya walked toward the booth and picked up her notebook. The worn cover looked ordinary. The corners were bent. The pages were filled with notes written in neat handwriting. To most people, it appeared to be the notebook of a curious child. But as she carried it back toward the screen, the room watched her with a completely different kind of attention. Richard folded his arms. "What is the second problem?" he asked. Maya opened the notebook and flipped through several pages. "The challenge assumes the wrong starting condition," she said. "But that is not the only reason people reach the wrong answer." She stopped at a page covered in diagrams. "The challenge also rewards the wrong behavior." Several people frowned. Richard glanced at the executives around him. Nobody seemed to understand. Maya pointed toward the screen. "Every person who solves this is trying to win alone." The room remained silent. "They focus on proving they are the smartest person in the room." Maya looked at the audience. "That is why nobody notices the mistake." The statement landed harder than anyone expected, because it was no longer about numbers. It was no longer about logic. It was about ego. Richard felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward him. Not accusing, not hostile, simply observing. Maya continued. "If the challenge had been reviewed by people working together instead of competing against each other, someone would have found the problem years ago." The technology journalist near the back slowly lowered her phone. Her expression changed. The story she thought she was recording was becoming something much larger. An executive seated near Richard cleared his throat. "Actually," he said quietly, "she might be right." Another executive nodded. "We have always approached it individually." A third executive stared at the screen. Nobody ever questioned the framework because everyone wanted to be the one who solved it first. The realization spread through the room. Not like an explosion, more like a mirror being raised. People began recognizing parts of themselves in what Maya was describing. Richard looked at the challenge that had followed him for years. Suddenly, it seemed less like a symbol of intelligence and more like a symbol of something else. Pride, competition, assumption. Maya closed her notebook. "The answer was never hidden," she said softly. "People were just looking in the wrong direction." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The piano music drifting through the restaurant felt impossibly distant now. Cassandra watched her daughter and felt something she had not expected. Relief. Because for the first time that night, Maya was not proving how smart she was. She was showing people how limited their assumptions could be. Richard exhaled slowly. Then he asked a question nobody expected. "How long did it take you to figure this out?" Maya thought for a moment. "About 7 minutes." A stunned silence swept through the room. Several executives immediately checked their watches as if the answer might somehow change. It did not. 7 minutes. A challenge that had survived years of scrutiny had been unraveled in less time than it took most guests to finish an appetizer. And for the first time that evening, Richard Kessler found himself wondering whether the smallest person in the room might understand success better than everyone else combined. 7 minutes. The number lingered in the air long after Maya said it. Nobody challenged her. Nobody laughed. Nobody even attempted a joke. The atmosphere inside Veritas Crown had changed completely. Earlier that evening, people had gathered around Richard Kessler because he was the most powerful person in the room. Now they were gathered around Maya Brooks because she had become the most interesting. Richard looked at the challenge screen one more time before turning back toward Maya. 7 minutes, he repeated quietly. Maya nodded. "Yes, sir." The billionaire studied her face, searching for arrogance, searching for pride, searching for the kind of confidence that usually followed a public victory. He found none of it. Maya looked exactly the same as she had when she first stood up from the booth. Calm, respectful, unimpressed by attention. That bothered him more than he expected. Most adults who challenged him wanted recognition. They wanted influence. They wanted something. Maya seemed interested only in understanding the truth. Near the back of the room, the technology journalist finally spoke. How did you learn to think like that? Several heads turned toward Maya. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Maya glanced at her mother. Cassandra immediately looked away, uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. For years she had worked quietly, carrying trays, cleaning tables, and taking extra shifts whenever bills became difficult. She never imagined strangers would one day ask questions about how she raised her daughter. Maya smiled softly. My mom taught me. Cassandra's eyes widened. No, I did not, she said before she could stop herself. A few guests laughed gently. Not the cruel laughter from earlier. This time it felt warm. Maya shook her head. You did. The room listened. My mom always tells me that if everyone is looking in one direction, I should look twice before following them. Cassandra stared at her daughter. She barely remembered saying those words. They had come during an ordinary conversation years ago while helping Maya with homework at their small kitchen table. Yet somehow Maya had remembered. Richard remained silent. Maya continued. She says that people miss things when they are too busy trying to impress each other. The statement landed with remarkable accuracy. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One investor actually laughed at himself. Another slowly lowered his eyes. The truth had a strange way of finding people. Cassandra felt emotion rising in her chest. Not because Maya had solved the challenge. Not because a room full of wealthy strangers finally respected her daughter. But because Maya had revealed something every parent hopes to discover. She had been listening all along. Richard walked toward a nearby chair and sat down. Nobody could remember the last time they had seen him sit, while everyone else stood. It was a small detail, but powerful people rarely surrendered height without realizing it. Tell me something, Richard said. Do you always carry that notebook? Maya looked down at the worn cover in her hands. Every day. Why? Maya opened it carefully. Pages filled with observations appeared beneath the light. Notes, questions, sketches, ideas, thoughts collected over years. Because I forget things, she answered. Richard smiled faintly. You do not seem like someone who forgets much. Maya smiled back. Everybody forgets things. She paused, then added, that is why I write them down. Richard looked at the notebook. For the first time that evening, he was no longer interested in the challenge. He was interested in the person who had solved it. And he had the growing feeling that the biggest surprise of the night had not happened yet. Richard Kessler could not stop looking at the notebook. The restaurant around him seemed to fade into the background. The investors were still there. The executives were still watching. Reporters were still recording. Yet his attention remained fixed on the worn collection of pages resting in Maya's hands. In a world obsessed with polished presentations and expensive credentials, the notebook looked almost insignificant. That was precisely what made it fascinating. Richard slowly stood from his chair and took a few steps closer. May I see it? He asked. Maya glanced at Cassandra. Her mother gave a small nod. Maya handed the notebook to him without hesitation. Richard opened it carefully. The first page contained observations about traffic patterns near a local intersection. The next page contained notes about customer behavior inside grocery stores. Then came pages filled with questions. Hundreds of questions. Why do people trust confidence more than accuracy? Why do groups repeat mistakes after recognizing them? Why do successful companies ignore small warnings until they become large problems? Richard turned another page. Then another. His expression changed with each one. This was not the work of a child collecting random thoughts. It was the work of someone training herself to see what others overlooked. The room grew quieter as Richard continued reading. A venture capitalist leaned forward. A journalist took a step closer. Even Cassandra had never seen anyone study Maya's notebook with such intensity. Finally, Richard stopped on a page near the middle. What is this? He asked. Maya looked at the drawing. A model. Richard raised an eyebrow. A model of what? Maya pointed to several diagrams connected by arrows. Decision failure. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Maya continued. I started noticing that people often make mistakes for the same reasons. They rush. They assume. They copy each other. So I began tracking patterns. Richard looked down again. The page contained dozens of examples collected over years. School projects, business case studies, historical events, everyday situations, different circumstances leading to surprisingly similar outcomes. One executive quietly stood and moved closer. Then another. Soon a small crowd surrounded the notebook. Nobody had planned to spend their evening studying a child's observations. Yet nobody wanted to look away. Richard turned another page and suddenly froze. His eyes narrowed, then widened. Wait. The word escaped before he could stop it. Maya looked up. What? Richard slowly tapped a section of notes. This framework. He looked back at her. Where did you get this idea? Maya studied the page. I made it. Richard looked genuinely stunned. The framework described a method for identifying hidden assumptions before making major decisions. Simple, elegant, practical. The kind of idea consultants charged enormous fees to create. Richard glanced toward two senior executives from Kessler Dynamics. Both were already reading over his shoulder. Neither appeared capable of speaking. One finally whispered, "This could save companies millions." The statement sent another ripple through the room. Maya seemed surprised by the reaction. Really? She asked. The executive nodded immediately. Richard looked back at the notebook, then at Maya, then back at the notebook again. The challenge from earlier suddenly felt small, almost irrelevant, because he was beginning to understand something far more significant. Maya had not solved the puzzle. She had revealed a way of thinking, and the more Richard read, the more he realized that the most valuable thing in the room was not sitting at his table. It was standing quietly in front of him, wondering why everyone seemed so surprised. The crowd surrounding Maya grew larger with every passing minute. What had started as an evening centered around one of the most powerful executives in Silicon Valley had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. People were no longer discussing market trends, investment opportunities, or corporate acquisitions. They were discussing a 10-year-old girl and a notebook filled with ideas. Richard Kessler slowly closed the notebook and held it carefully, almost respectfully. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Earlier that night, he had treated Maya like a source of entertainment. Now he handled her work with the same attention he reserved for billion-dollar proposals. Around the room, conversations erupted in quiet clusters. Executives pointed toward specific pages they had seen. Investors debated the practical applications of Maya's frameworks. Reporters exchanged excited looks, already realizing they were witnessing a story far larger than a simple challenge. Cassandra stood near the edge of the gathering, overwhelmed by everything happening around her. She had spent years trying to give her daughter opportunities despite limited resources. Extra shifts, missed weekends, long nights balancing bills at the kitchen table. She never expected any of it to lead here. Yet as she watched Maya answer questions from people who normally spoke only with chief executives and industry leaders, she felt something stronger than pride. She felt vindication. Richard looked toward Cassandra. For the first time all evening, his attention settled on the person he had barely noticed before. "How long have you known she thinks this way?" he asked. Cassandra laughed softly. "Since she was little." Several people smiled. Richard shook his head in disbelief. "And nobody has seen this notebook before?" Cassandra shrugged. "Most people never asked." The answer struck the room harder than anyone expected. Most people never asked. Such a simple sentence. Yet it explained everything. Maya had not been hidden. Her ideas had not been locked away. The opportunity to discover her had existed all along. People simply failed to look. The realization spread through the crowd. Some guests glanced down at their own tables. Others exchanged thoughtful expressions. It was uncomfortable to admit how often they judged value based on appearances. Richard looked around the restaurant and recognized the same truth. Earlier that evening, nearly everyone had assumed the smartest person in the room would be one of the executives, one of the investors, one of the successful entrepreneurs. Nobody expected the most original thinker to be the daughter of a waitress. Maya remained unaware of the impact she was having. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. The question drew a wave of gentle laughter. Not mocking laughter, genuine laughter, warm laughter. Richard smiled. "No," he said. "You did something very right." Then he turned toward the crowd. "How many people here would have looked at that notebook if I had not challenged her tonight?" No hands rose. Not one. The silence answered for everyone. Richard nodded slowly. "That is what bothers me." The room became still again, because everyone understood what he meant. The greatest surprise was not Maya's intelligence. The greatest surprise was how many people had failed to see it. And as dozens of phones continued recording and conversations spread beyond the restaurant walls, one thing became increasingly clear. The balance of attention had completely shifted. The room no longer belonged to the billionaire who entered as its center of gravity. Without trying, without boasting, and without seeking recognition, Maya Brooks had become the person everyone came to see. The energy inside Veritas' crown remained electric long after the original challenge had been forgotten. People continued discussing Maya's notebook, her observations, and the quiet confidence that had transformed the entire evening. Yet the most important moment was still waiting to happen. Richard Kessler stood silently for several seconds, looking first at Maya and then at Cassandra. The billionaire who had entered the restaurant expecting admiration now found himself confronting something much more valuable: perspective. He took a slow breath and stepped toward Cassandra. The room immediately grew quiet. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Richard extended the notebook back to Maya. "Thank you for letting me read this," he said. Maya accepted it with a polite smile. Then Richard turned to Cassandra. "I owe you an apology." A ripple moved through the crowd. Powerful people rarely apologized in public. Truly powerful people almost never did. Cassandra looked surprised. Richard continued. "When I first saw you tonight, I saw a waitress." He paused. "I should have seen a mother." Nobody spoke. The restaurant felt completely still. Richard glanced toward Maya. "And when I first saw Maya, I saw a child." He shook his head slightly. "I should have seen a remarkable thinker." The words carried no performance. No public relations strategy. No attempt to impress anyone. They sounded honest. Cassandra nodded respectfully. "Thank you," she replied. Richard looked around the room. "There is a lesson here for all of us." Several executives lowered their eyes. Others listened carefully. Richard continued. "We spend so much time evaluating people based on titles, positions, and appearances that we forget to look for actual talent." He gestured toward Maya. "Tonight, the smartest person in this room was the one nobody expected." A few guests quietly applauded. Then more joined them. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was clapping. Not for a puzzle. Not for a challenge. For Maya. The sound filled the room. Maya looked embarrassed by the attention and instinctively moved closer to her mother. The gesture made people smile even more. Richard reached into his jacket and removed a business card. He handed it to Cassandra. "This is my direct number." Cassandra looked at the card, uncertain what to say. Richard smiled. "I would like to help create opportunities for Maya. Educational opportunities. Mentorship. Whatever she needs." Maya blinked. "Why?" she asked. Richard looked at her and answered with complete sincerity. "Because the world needs people who ask better questions." The applause returned. A few guests wiped away tears. The journalist near the back lowered her phone for the first time all evening. She realized the story was no longer about a billionaire. It was no longer about money. It was about dignity, recognition, possibility. As the evening finally began winding down, guests returned to their tables carrying a different conversation than the one they had arrived with. They spoke less about success and more about potential, less about status and more about character. Maya slipped her notebook back under her arm. Cassandra placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Together, they started toward the exit. Before leaving, Maya turned back one last time. Richard was still standing in the center of the room. Earlier, everyone had been looking at him. Now he was looking at her. Maya offered a small smile. Richard smiled back. Then the doors closed behind them. The challenge was forgotten. The laughter was forgotten. What remained was a lesson nobody in that restaurant would ever forget. Money could command attention. Power could fill a room. But wisdom, humility, and courage could change one. And on that night, a little girl carrying a worn notebook taught an entire room that greatness is often hidden in the people the world overlooks.